Did you know that even the strongest political giants can crumble faster than anyone expects? For years, Donald Trump has dominated headlines, rallies, and conversations. But beneath the surface, cracks are widening in ways few anticipated. From courtroom battles to global isolation, the challenges stacking against him are unlike anything he has faced before. What if the very image of strength that carried him this far is now becoming his greatest weakness? Stay with us, because in this video, we'll uncover 10 powerful reasons why Trump is in far deeper trouble than almost anyone imagined. Number 1. Economic promises versus harsh reality. When Donald Trump first stepped onto the political stage, he framed himself as the savior of the American worker, the one who could reverse decades of decline and restore prosperity. His rallies were filled with bold claims about bringing back jobs, boosting wages, and fixing the economy for those who had been left behind. But fast forward to today, and the reality looks very different. The same working-class voters who once believed in the promise of a financial revival are now facing the stubborn realities of inflation, rising costs, and stagnant wages. The middle class feels squeezed, paying more for groceries, housing, and gas, while seeing little improvement in their income. For many Americans, the economic dream they were promised has turned into an everyday struggle, creating deep resentment toward the very leader who claimed to have their backs. The numbers reveal a troubling story. Real wages, what workers actually take home after adjusting for inflation, have barely moved in decades, and under Trump's policies, this trend didn't suddenly change. The promise of new factories and revitalized industries mostly turned into headlines without substance. Some jobs did return, but often at lower pay or with less security than before. At the same time, corporate profits and stock market growth soared, benefiting the wealthiest slice of society far more than the ordinary family. This gap between rhetoric and reality has not gone unnoticed. Workers expected to feel the benefits of a booming economy, but instead they saw their bills rise faster than their paychecks, leaving them worse off than they were promised. For Trump, this disconnect is a serious weakness. Economic dissatisfaction is not just a statistic, it is a lived experience for millions of people who feel betrayed. Families facing $6 cartons of eggs or skyrocketing rent do not forget the promises of relief and prosperity they once applauded. The frustration turns into anger, and that anger is increasingly directed at him. What was once his strongest selling point, the idea that he alone could fix the economy, has become a liability. Instead of being remembered as the man who delivered prosperity, he risks being seen as the leader who failed to stop a worsening crisis, leaving working Americans more skeptical and disillusioned than ever. Number 2. Tariffs as a double-edged sword. One of Trump's most talked about policies was his aggressive use of tariffs. Pitched as a clever way to protect American industries and punish foreign competitors, the message was simple: put America first, shield domestic jobs, and force other countries to play fair. On the surface, it sounded appealing, especially to workers in manufacturing towns who felt abandoned by globalization. Tariffs were marketed as a tool that would make foreign products more expensive, pushing consumers to buy American goods, and in theory, strengthening the economy from within. But the reality of tariffs is far more complicated than the political slogans suggested. Far from being a free win for American families, tariffs became a hidden tax that landed squarely on the shoulders of the very people Trump claimed to be defending. Here's how it played out in practice. When tariffs were slapped on Chinese steel, electronics, or everyday imports, the companies that relied on those goods simply raised their prices to offset the higher costs. American consumers, not foreign governments, ended up footing the bill. Suddenly, household budgets were stretched thinner, with everything from washing machines to cars becoming more expensive. For businesses that depended on imported parts, the tariffs were devastating, cutting into profits and forcing layoffs. Instead of reviving industries, tariffs in many cases introduced new hardships, creating ripple effects across sectors that were supposed to be protected. Economists widely noted that while tariffs may sound like punishment for other countries, they behave like a tax at home, quietly draining money from ordinary families. This contradiction strikes at the heart of Trump's image as an economic champion. The working class was told tariffs would level the playing field, but what they experienced was higher costs and fewer opportunities. For small business owners and blue-collar workers alike, the policy created more frustration than relief. The bold promise of tariffs as a weapon against unfair trade has instead turned into a reminder of how political decisions can backfire when real-world economics are ignored. What was meant to showcase strength now highlights a weakness, a failure to deliver tangible benefits where they were most needed. And as voters look back, many see tariffs not as protection but as another burden, one that undermines Trump's credibility and adds to the growing list of troubles he cannot easily explain away. Number 3, immigration promises colliding with reality. From the very start of his political career, Trump made immigration the centerpiece of his message. He promised walls, mass deportations, and a renewed sense of national security by cutting the flow of undocumented immigrants. For many of his supporters, this stance struck a chord, tapping into economic fears, cultural anxieties, and the desire for order in a world that felt chaotic. But once slogans met reality, the situation quickly exposed deep contradictions. The United States economy, particularly in sectors like agriculture, construction, and service industries, depends heavily on immigrant labor. These workers often take jobs that others avoid, and without them, entire industries struggle to function. Trying to remove millions of people was never just a legal or logistical challenge. It was an economic risk that Trump underestimated. As enforcement ramped up, the cracks started showing. Farmers reported crops left to rot in the fields because there weren't enough hands to pick them. Restaurants and small businesses, already battling rising costs, faced labor shortages that left them unable to keep up with demand. Even tech giants quietly raised concerns, knowing that a significant portion of their innovation relied on skilled immigrants arriving through specialized visas. This wasn't just about compassion or politics, it was about practicality. The idea of eliminating millions of immigrants from the workforce clashed head-on with the reality that America's prosperity had long been tied to their contributions. Every attempt to enforce hardline policies triggered unintended consequences that rippled through the economy, creating frustration among both business owners and consumers. The contradiction became unavoidable. The same administration that rallied its base by attacking immigrants also relied on them to keep the economy moving. Everyday Americans noticed the fallout too. From higher prices at grocery stores to delays in basic services. Instead of delivering stability, the crackdown exposed how deeply interconnected immigration is with American life. For Trump, this is more than a policy failure. It's a credibility problem. His strongest talking point has turned into a reminder that campaign promises without workable solutions can backfire spectacularly. As voters weigh the costs, the gap between fiery rhetoric and lived experience grows sharper, leaving Trump vulnerable to criticism, not just from opponents, but also from those who once believed his words would translate into real-world relief. Number 4, economic contradictions exposed by tariffs. When Trump declared that tariffs would be his weapon of choice, it sounded like a simple fix. He argued that by taxing imports, he would punish foreign competitors, protect American industries, and bring back lost jobs. On the surface, this promise resonated with workers who had seen their factories close and their communities decline. But the deeper economic reality was far more complicated. A tariff, no matter how it's framed, is still a tax, and contrary to the way it was often presented, it wasn't China or Mexico footing the bill. It was American businesses and ultimately American consumers. The moment those costs hit companies, prices started to climb on everything from electronics to basic household goods. What was supposed to be a bold stand for the working class became a direct hit on their wallets. For decades, the Republican Party branded itself as the party of low taxes and free markets. Trump's tariffs flipped that identity upside down. Suddenly, a movement that prided itself on opposing new taxes was defending policies that raised them in broad daylight. Importers scrambled to adjust, some shifting production overseas, others passing the costs directly to shoppers. Families who had once cheered for economic revival were left asking why groceries, clothing, and even cars were suddenly more expensive. Instead of protecting workers, tariffs threatened to erode their purchasing power. This contradiction created a wedge not only between Trump and his opponents, but within his own base. Business leaders warned of long-term consequences, while frustrated voters wondered why the promised America First prosperity seemed to be slipping further away. The political cost is just as severe as the economic one. By leaning on tariffs, Trump walked straight into a policy trap. If he backed down, he would look weak. If he doubled down, he risked alienating everyday Americans struggling with higher costs. The contradiction is unsustainable because it pits two of his key narratives against each other. He can't simultaneously be the defender of the working class and the architect of rising living expenses. Over time, this tension has chipped away at his credibility. What was pitched as a bold economic strategy has become a textbook example of how political slogans unravel when they collide with global markets. And for Trump, that unraveling has left him exposed to critics who see tariffs not as a triumph of strength, but as evidence of miscalculation. Number 5. Alienation of traditional allies. One of Trump's defining strategies was to treat America's allies less like partners and more like adversaries. Instead of nurturing long-standing relationships with Europe, Canada, or even Japan, he turned diplomacy into a transactional game of pressure and demands. Tariffs were slapped on steel and aluminum imports from friendly nations. Threats were issued over NATO contributions, with Trump framing alliances as burdens rather than strengths. At first, this approach energized his base, who believed the United States had been taken advantage of for too long. But beneath the political theater, it created cracks in global relationships that had been carefully built over decades. Allies who once stood firmly alongside America began looking for new partnerships, hedging their bets against an unpredictable Washington. The alienation of allies has severe consequences that go far beyond hurt feelings. Europe, once a reliable pillar of American strategy, started to explore greater independence. From defense planning to trade deals with other blocs, Canada and Mexico, bound by proximity and trade, bristled under threats and retaliatory tariffs. Even Japan, traditionally one of America's closest economic and security partners, began strengthening ties with China to avoid being caught in the crossfire. For global companies and investors, this unpredictability was more damaging than any single policy. Markets depend on stability, and Trump's erratic handling of allies replaced predictability with constant uncertainty. The message to the world was clear. The United States was no longer the steady hand it once claimed to be. Domestically, the consequences of this alienation are now becoming clear. By weakening alliances, Trump inadvertently strengthened America's competitors. Nations excluded or offended by Washington turned toward China and Russia, accelerating the rise of blocs like BRICS. Instead of isolating rivals, his policies isolated the United States, leaving fewer countries willing to support American positions on trade, sanctions, or global security. For a president who campaigned on restoring strength and dominance, the irony is striking. He may have promised to put America first, but in practice, he often left America standing alone. And when the world begins to view you as unreliable, regaining that trust becomes a far steeper climb. This self-inflicted isolation is not just a diplomatic headache, it is a fundamental weakness that leaves the U.S. and Trump himself in deeper trouble than even his critics initially anticipated. Number 6, escalating legal battles. While Trump has always carried a cloud of lawsuits and investigations around him, the scale and seriousness of his current legal challenges are unprecedented. From allegations of business fraud to probes into election interference, these cases are no longer small distractions. They have become central to his political and personal life. Courtrooms across the country are now stages where Trump's conduct is dissected in detail, often with devastating revelations that dominate headlines for weeks. Unlike political attacks, which he can dismiss as partisan, legal proceedings bring evidence, witnesses, and rulings that are far harder to wave away. Each new indictment or investigation chips away at his credibility, reinforcing the narrative that he is entangled in a web of misconduct too large to escape. These legal battles also carry a practical cost that goes beyond reputation. Mounting defenses requires vast sums of money, drawing heavily from campaign donations and political fundraising that might otherwise fuel his rallies and outreach. Supporters who once contributed enthusiastically are beginning to question whether their money is funding political change or simply paying endless lawyer fees. Meanwhile, the constant drip of negative stories creates fatigue even among sympathetic voters. The longer these trials drag on, the more they dominate the conversation, leaving little room for Trump to control the narrative or focus on policy promises. In the eyes of undecided or moderate voters, the image of a candidate endlessly tied to courtroom drama feels less like strength and more like weakness. The most dangerous element of these escalating legal troubles is their unpredictability. A single unfavorable ruling could reshape the trajectory of his campaign or even his personal finances. The perception of invincibility that once surrounded Trump, his ability to dodge scandals and emerge stronger, now appears vulnerable. Voters who once admired his defiance may grow weary of a candidate whose energy seems consumed by survival rather than leadership. Rivals within his own party quietly seize on this weakness, positioning themselves as cleaner alternatives. And internationally, allies and adversaries alike watch closely, questioning how long a nation can rally around a leader mired in lawsuits. Far from being a minor inconvenience, Trump's legal entanglements are becoming one of the clearest signs that his troubles are far deeper than even his fiercest critics had originally imagined. Number 7. Erosion of party unity. Trump once held the Republican Party firmly in his grip, shaping its agenda, silencing dissent, and commanding loyalty. But over time, cracks have begun to widen inside the party, and the signs of division are becoming harder to ignore. Behind closed doors, many Republican leaders acknowledge the difficulties of supporting a candidate weighed down by legal battles, controversial remarks, and volatile decision-making, while some still publicly back him out of fear of alienating his base. Others are quietly building distance, testing the waters for a post-Trump political future. The once solid wall of unity is no longer guaranteed, and in politics, perception of weakness can be as damaging as weakness itself. The image of a divided party diminishes his ability to project dominance, leaving voters wondering whether his influence is truly permanent or fading. These divisions are not just at the leadership level. They are visible among voters too. Some lifelong conservatives are frustrated by the lack of focus on policy solutions and weary of the endless drama. Younger Republicans, especially those entering politics in the last decade, often see Trump as a relic of an era that cannot adapt to the future. Meanwhile, influential figures like governors and senators are increasingly willing to position themselves as alternative leaders, creating a sense of competition that undermines Trump's monopoly over the party's direction. Fundraising patterns also highlight this erosion, with some donors channeling their money toward rising stars instead of pouring resources into Trump's legal defenses or campaign coffers. The erosion of party unity carries dangerous consequences for any candidate, but particularly for Trump. Elections are not won solely on devoted bases. They require building coalitions, energizing moderates, and consolidating party machinery. If his campaign cannot command the same level of loyalty it once did, every state primary becomes riskier, and the general election becomes far harder to secure. More importantly, the loss of unity signals to the broader public that his leadership is contested, weakening the aura of inevitability he once used to intimidate rivals. For a man who has thrived on projecting dominance, even the hint of division can be fatal. Trump may still command loud crowds and passionate loyalty in some purrs, but without the solid backing of a unified party, his political empire rests on shakier ground than ever before. Number 8. Economic promises versus harsh realities. For years, Trump has positioned himself as the businessman who could fix the American economy, boasting about growth, jobs, and stock market highs during his presidency. Yet the economic landscape today makes those promises far harder to deliver. Rising inflation, stagnant wages, and widening inequality have created frustration across the political spectrum, leaving many to question whether Trump's policies were ever more than short-term boosts. His reliance on tariffs, for example, was touted as a way to protect American workers, but in reality it functioned as a tax on consumers and businesses, raising prices without addressing structural problems. The contradiction between the image he projects and the outcomes people feel in their daily lives is now sharper than ever. Adding to this tension is the fact that younger generations have grown up in an economy defined by debt, unstable housing, and limited upward mobility. For them, promises of making America great again ring hollow when rent is unaffordable and student loans dominate their futures. Many of these younger voters do not credit Trump for a strong economy, but rather see his approach as outdated and disconnected from their realities. Even among older voters, rising costs of essentials like food, healthcare, and energy have eroded confidence in the idea that Trump can single-handedly bring economic stability. His critics argue that his rhetoric oversimplifies a global system that cannot be solved through slogans, and his inability to adapt his message to shifting conditions exposes a gap between his claims and the hardships people continue to endure. This widening gap creates not just voter skepticism, but also political vulnerability. When candidates rely on their record, they must ensure it resonates with people's lived experiences. For Trump, the nostalgia for better economic times collides with the stark memory of trade wars, tax cuts benefiting the wealthy, and mounting national debt. As voters look for leadership that can navigate today's unpredictable global economy, his insistence on replaying old talking points feels less persuasive. Instead of rallying hope, his economic message risks sounding repetitive and out of touch. The very strength he once used to define his brand, his supposed mastery of economic success, may now become one of his greatest weaknesses, deepening the perception that Trump's trouble is not just political but rooted in his inability to deliver on the promises that matter most. Number 9. Growing international isolation. A defining feature of Trump's political brand has been his insistence on putting America first, often at the expense of international cooperation. While this approach resonated with some voters, it left deep scars on global relationships that the United States had spent decades cultivating. Today, many allies remain cautious, wondering whether a second Trump presidency would mean renewed unpredictability, abandoned commitments, or open hostility. Leaders in Europe, Asia, and Latin America have already begun building stronger economic and military ties with each other, reducing their reliance on Washington. Very alliances that once gave the U.S. global strength are now fragile, and Trump's return to the world stage threatens to accelerate the drift toward multipolar power. This isolation is not just about diplomacy. It directly affects America's economic and security interests. When countries shift trade and investment toward blocs like BRICS, U.S. companies lose access to markets, and the dollar's dominance slowly erodes. At the same time, international cooperation on climate change, technology, and global health weakens when America is seen as an unreliable partner. For ordinary Americans, that means higher prices, fewer opportunities, and diminished influence over global rules that shape their everyday lives. Trump's hardline stance on tariffs and sanctions has already encouraged rivals like China and Russia to strengthen their partnerships, creating parallel systems that sideline the United States. Far from making America stronger, this trend risks leaving it more isolated and less capable of leading in a rapidly changing world. The danger for Trump is that international isolation feeds back into his domestic image. Americans may be patriotic, but they are also pragmatic. When global hostility translates into lost jobs, shrinking exports, or diplomatic crises, voters begin to question whether America first is actually America alone. The symbolism of standing up to foreign powers may excite a rally crowd, but the long-term costs are harder to dismiss. If allies no longer trust the United States and adversaries no longer fear it, then Trump's claim of strength looks more like weakness on a global scale. This erosion of international credibility not only undermines America's position in the world, but also deepens the sense that Trump's leadership leaves the country more vulnerable than secure. Number 10. Shifting public sentiment. Perhaps the most subtle yet devastating challenge for Trump is the gradual shift in public sentiment. During his first campaigns, his brash style outsider image, and promises of disruption electrified voters who felt ignored by traditional politicians. But over time, shock value loses its edge, and repetition breeds fatigue. What once seemed fresh and bold now feels familiar and predictable, even to some of his supporters. Crowds may still gather, and chants may still echo, but underneath lies a growing sense of exhaustion. People want solutions, not just slogans, and the longer everyday struggles persist, the harder it becomes to maintain unwavering enthusiasm. Surveys and polls increasingly reveal these cracks. While Trump still commands loyalty from a core base, the enthusiasm gap is widening among moderates and swing voters. Suburban families, young professionals, and first-time voters, groups critical to any national victory, are showing signs of disengagement or outright opposition. The narratives of endless conflict, legal troubles, and political chaos do not inspire hope, but instead create uncertainty about the future. In a climate where people are already weary from inflation, global instability, and political polarization, Trump's presence is beginning to feel like a source of added stress rather than relief. That perception matters deeply in a democracy shaped by emotion as much as by policy. The danger for Trump is that once public sentiment begins to shift, it rarely reverses. Leaders who rely heavily on personality-driven politics are especially vulnerable because their brand depends on energy, excitement, and unwavering devotion. Without those elements, campaigns lose momentum, fundraising dries up, and media coverage grows less favorable. Trump has always thrived on the appearance of unstoppable popularity, but if Americans increasingly see him as a symbol of division and decline, the aura of inevitability shatters. More than court cases, more than party politics, it is this slow but steady erosion of public faith that places him in deeper trouble than even his harshest critics once expected. In politics, perception shapes reality, and the perception that Trump is losing his grip may soon become the reality that defines his downfall. The picture that emerges is undeniable. Trump's troubles are not just mounting, they are compounding in ways that make survival far harder than before. Each of the 10 reasons we've discussed, legal battles, economic contradictions, global isolation, shifting public sentiment, and more, form a web of challenges that no single rally speech or fiery slogan can easily untangle. What makes this moment different is the scale and the speed of the pressures closing in from every direction. He's not only battling rivals in politics, but also institutions, economies, and global realities that are far larger than any campaign. For his base, loyalty may still run deep, but loyalty cannot erase fatigue, nor can it rebuild fractured alliances or undo court rulings. For undecided voters, the constant drama feels less like leadership and more like chaos. And for the rest of the world, America under Trump represents uncertainty rather than stability. That combination leaves him standing on much shakier ground than in past battles. History shows us that great powers, political figures, and empires rarely collapse overnight. Instead, they unravel piece by piece until the turning point becomes impossible to ignore. Trump may still project confidence, but the tide is shifting, and the forces working against him are growing too vast to contain. Whether you support him or oppose him, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. Trump is in far deeper trouble than even his fiercest critics anticipated, and the storm around him is only getting stronger.